Greetings, this is Artie from Artifact Electronics, and here we have a GW Instek GFG-3015 function generator. This was generally donated to the channel by a viewer and a friend. Thanks, David. I'm going to be putting this to good use. One of the problems we have here is the power switch is missing. As you can see, there's a gaping hole here. The actual electrical switch is way in the back over here, and like a lot of other instruments, it has a plastic rod. It had the button and a plastic rod that went through and then angled down to depress the switch, the mechanical switch, and thus turn it on and off. But the switch was missing. I guess it broke off. And unfortunately, whoever tried to fix it or deal with it, I mean, what they did was they opened it up and clicked the power switch inside to be permanently on. So it works. But you have to plug it in and out or use a power strip like this to turn it on. Now, all of the leftover bits and pieces of the rod that were in here at one point were discarded. They were not. I was hoping that there'd be stuff floating around inside, but there really wasn't anything. I needed the instrument in the early morning hours to do some frequency testing on stuff, and of course I got distracted because it bugged me to no end that there was no power switch on here. So I did already put a power switch in, but I messed up because the cabinet was disassembled, and it works. There is actually a switch there, but there are some mechanical problems, and those problems are, here's the switch I put in, but as you can already guess, when I was drilling the hole for the switch, these standoffs weren't there. So I put everything back together, and when it came time to put this in, yeah, I had a switch now, but not only was it in the back of the instrument, but I had to do finger calisthenics from the front, you know, to get this thing to go up and down. And that's unacceptable. So what we're going to do is do a quick teardown of this, but since we've already opened it, move the switch somewhere here or here, so it's easily accessible when you're doing the classic reach around on it, and to turn it on and off. So let's remove some screws. Removing a bunch of screws and handles and standoffs, let's just get inside. At first glance, we can immediately see this is not exactly HP quality, such as these guys over here, but I think there's a rather large price difference in the retail prices between the two, probably a factor of 3 or more, so you get what you pay for, right? I mean, here's like the outer case, which is really flimsy. I mean, you put anything of substance on it, it's going to dent that case. But from what I've seen so far, it does the job. So I should stop complaining about it. And let's have a look inside. The main PCB we're looking at is mostly, if not exclusively, analog. We have a plethora of heat sinks here with regulating transistors, a whole bunch of relays, mechanical relays. There's 11 of them, I counted, that are used to switch ranges and such. And then of course the front panel is where all the digital and I/O stuff is located. We have our keyboards, our controls, our plugs, and of course the display. And here is the hole I was talking about. I was trying to stick a rod through it, and it wouldn't go, and then I finally remembered I had taped it shut because this wasn't going to be used. But let's have a look at what the original switch looked like. The original switch was mounted over here. You can kind of see the outline on the PCB. And I removed that switch. It looks like this. Just a single push button. This one is a double pole single throw, which means when you turn it on, it connects two independent contacts. It connects this one to this one and this one to this one, and when you unlatch it, it breaks the connection between both of those. And that was mounted in here in a fashion, something like that. And then we had a rod coming from the front, from the hole we looked at, and the rod would travel through the hole, come all the way back, probably do some weird angled stuff, and give you the opportunity, you know, when you press the switch, you just activated or deactivated this. Now, I played around with some wooden dowels and stuff like that, trying to replace the rod, but that didn't quite work because there's stuff in the way. I mean, the original rod isn't there. I don't know the geometry of it, but you can probably see here there's a bunch of capacitors and things, this one particularly, that's in the way of the rod. So I don't know if they curved it up and over, and anyway, the easiest solution to me, it seemed, was to just replace the functionality of this switch by a toggle switch. Now the problem I had, if I did this properly, I would have used a single throw, double pole toggle switch, but this was in the early morning hours and I didn't have one. So what I did was I cheated. I basically shorted the neutral line on the switch, the original neutral line, and I'm only switching the hot. This is sitting on the AC input. These fuses, both of these fuses are on each leg of the AC input. So this isn't a 100% proper way of doing this, but it does work, and for my purposes, it should do just fine. So what we got to do now is move this switch, because, you know, when I installed it, the panel looked like this, and it looked like a perfectly reasonable place to put the switch, but once you put these standoffs on here, they do a good job of hiding it. So we're going to move it, I don't know, somewhere over here. Let's see what's behind. There really isn't anything behind it, only the frame of the fan. So probably drill somewhere around here, move the switch. No soldering required, because I can just unfasten the nut, take out the switch with the wires attached, and move it over here. So let's do that. A new hole was drilled, the switch was moved over, and I even plugged up the old hole. So this should give me enough finger space now with something like this installed that I can easily get to that switch. Good deal. So I'm back on the inside. It's pretty clean. We just got those two wires from the switch going and doing this connection, and as mentioned before, the neutral is permanently shorted. So we should be good to go. Here she is, all buttoned up with plenty of room for even someone with fat fingers like mine to be able to operate that switch. Yeah, I guess it needs a label that says on/off on it. What I forgot to mention was I did make an effort to look for the part for the power switch rod. Couldn't find anything generally. I went to their website, and this is a retired product, and they did not have a parts section or a service section there that I could see. So this is a solution that we're going to live with. An interesting fact was what the GW stands for. I thought it was like the founder's initials, but it stands for Goodwill. And for those of you who don't know, Goodwill is a pretty large chain of thrift or charity shops in the US. And I just kind of thought it was funny that this is basically the Goodwill house brand. I just wish they would spell it out completely. That would be pretty funny if it said Goodwill Instek. Anyway, enough misguided humor. Let's see what she does. Okay, so now that we put it all back together, let's have a quick look at some basic functionality on it, see how well it works. So, breaking in the new power switch. And there we are. It's currently outputting 440 Hertz at 5 volts, I guess. Nice looking square wave there. Let's go a little bit higher. So what we want to do is use the frequency button, type in 100 kilohertz, and it times out really quickly. So 100 kilohertz. And we'll let it auto adjust itself. And there we are. Now this is rated at 15 megahertz at its highest. So let's see. Actually, let's have a look at the other waveforms first. So we're looking at the square. We can change the duty cycle of it, I think down to 20%. Yeah, and when you try to go below 20, it gives you that error saying I can't. And I think we can go up to 80%. And again, it gives you the error when you go above, but there's our 80% duty cycle. And then, let's see, I can use these buttons to select a digit. Makes it a little bit easier to adjust, and we're back at 50%. The next waveform we have is a sine wave. That looks pretty good too. Still running at 100 kilohertz, and you probably can't really see this, but the frequency counter on the scope says we are at 99.996 kilohertz. So that one's working, seems to be working okay. And last but not least, we have a triangle. So we push function again, and we're now in a triangle. So the basic waveforms look fine, and the frequency seems to match up pretty well with what this thinks it's outputting and what the scope thinks it's getting. Now, we saw three basic waveforms. We saw the square wave with an adjustable duty cycle, the sine wave, and of course the triangle you're looking at. But that's not all, folks. We can actually use the duty cycle setting to turn this into a sawtooth, or at least the manual says so, which means we should I actually had to print out the manual because the user interface, I mean, it looks plentiful, but I don't know, it's, well, maybe I'm probably just stupid, but some of the things, I mean, the big buttons on top make perfect sense, but then all the buttons with double functions and stuff like that aren't always excessively clear on what they do. But if we go to duty cycle, and then we move the cursor over to that, look at that. Well, it doesn't let you make a perfect sawtooth, but because it gets stuck on the 20%, but It's a pretty good sawtooth, and if we go the other way, we can get a rising sawtooth, but the same limitation because we were only able to go to 80%. If it let you go to 100%, or we would have a perfect rising sawtooth, conversely we would have a perfectly falling sawtooth if we were able to go to 0. But here they are. And also keep in mind that when we started out we were showing 440 hertz. Well, that's actually audible, so there's lots of fun to be had to hook this output into a speaker and listen to what things sound like. It's actually pretty boring because the waveforms coming out of this are really clean, but I'll leave that to another episode, to use the function generator as a sound generator. And as you might have guessed, we can also skew the sine wave, again by altering the duty cycle. So we can go down to 20, it starts leaning left, and then of course we can go up to 80, which makes a really ugly sine wave, but again, if during a sound demo you could actually hear the difference, because the timbre of the sound will change depending on how impure the sine wave is. But again, for now, back to 50%. And one other test, of course, is this instrument's rated at up to 15 megahertz. So let's see if it can do 15 megahertz and what the scope thinks it is doing. And in order to do that, we need to say frequency. We type in 15 and hit the megahertz button. And boom. We will use the auto set on the scope. And it tells us that we are at 14.999 blah 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 megahertz. So it's true to its word. There you go. And of course it wouldn't be complete if we didn't see I mean, this is kind of funny, but it claims to be able to go down to 0.1 hertz. I don't know if the scope can handle that. So let's try 1 hertz first. So frequency 1 and hertz. And let's see if the scope knows what to do with it. Oh, yes it does. There's 1 hertz. Yep, can handle it, and well, the frequency counter just tells us less than 10 hertz. So, but hey, that's a 1 hertz sine wave, and the lowest the scope will go is 0.1 hertz. So if we do frequency 0.1 hertz, there you go. Let's see, does this go? Yeah, it does. So there you go. There's a 0.1 hertz sine wave that will also work. Well, let's go. Let's see what the other, if it works on the other functions. If we switch it to the triangle, as you can see, that works. And last but not least, go over to the square, and that also works. And you know, at those frequencies you don't really need a scope. You can use a meter and a stopwatch. Well, I'm impressed. It actually works really well. There are other goodies, gates, bursts, and it does modulation too. But in order to effectively demonstrate that, I would have to actually read the manual, and I don't like doing that. So, well, let's kind of try out the modulation real quick. Let's see. I mean, I'm not going to set the parameters. I'm just going to accept that there's some sort of a modulation curve in here, and we'll turn it on. And as you can see, it's doing frequency modulation here. So this is kind of like a house alarm or a police siren. And this is obviously doing frequency modulation, but we can also do amplitude modulation, which does exactly as the word says. It's kind of like a tremolo on an instrument. The sound rhythmically gets louder and softer. But if there's any more interest in this, let me know in the comments, and we will do an episode where we hook the whole thing up to a speaker and see if we can create neat stuff with it. One thing to warn you from, it's going to sound very sterile because it's essentially a single oscillator. And one of the reasons why musical instruments or synthesizers sound cool is they have multiple oscillators that are slightly detuned, and the beating that causes makes the sound interesting. This is just a very simple, I can already predict this is just a very simple sound. Too clean. Well, I hope you enjoyed the complicated diagnosis and subsequent fix for the missing power switch. I mean, that was all that was wrong with it, but I guess this may have ended up in a landfill after all in its current state, because people just went out and bought new equipment. Quite frankly, I love new equipment just like the next guy, but there's nothing wrong with this thing. I mean, rumor has it that this was used to test medical equipment, and if this unit was good enough to test medical equipment, it's still good enough to test medical equipment. But hey, what do I know? This is going to be very useful on the bench for me and replace some of the old function generators I have. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and share, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time.